James McConnell, obviously regular contributor, one of the world's greatest drillers in his career, and built many companies and sold them very successfully. But I want to, on that point, Jay, I make that introduction to set you up to perhaps or not challenge Adi's view there that Russian production won't be challenged, because without you and your peer group's technology and talent, how can Russian oil production not decline, or do they have the magic sauce and the ability to sustain? Your thoughts on that?
So to give full credit to Richard, he was a couple of minutes ahead of you with that question.
Okay.
So we seemed a little bit rude. Richard was asking that question.
Earth and Bernie having the chant.
Yeah, the answer is China. The truth of the matter is for the last 2-3 decades, obviously Russia, if you look at Russia through the late 90s, early 2000s, it was an enormous marketplace for Schlumberger, enormous, world's biggest oilfield services company. Baker Hughes were also in there in a big way, so were Halliburton. They're all gone now. But the technology, the very advanced drilling technology that we had all become used to operating in other parts of the world, that does the complex horizontal multilaterals, which enables you to produce huge amounts from single well borers, all of that technology is in China now. There was a if you like, even the stories of 5 lost directional turbines from Baker Hughes, where have they gone? Well, stripped down. I mean, I saw Halliburton technology in a manufacturing plant in China when it wasn't supposed to be there. The reality is China is the technology partner for Russia going forward, and I think, for me, I thought we'd have heard more about China in the conversation today, to be honest with you, because I think it is the massive rhinoceros' head in the middle of the room. Whether it's the consumption of low-cost oil from Russia, and as we've discovered this last week, not quite as low cost as it was supposed to be. So that's one of the lines that is out there. So Russia is selling its oil well above the price cap that is supposed to be in place. But there was a comment on one of the podcasts 4 or 5 days ago, which I went onto the chat room, and the one comment I would add, Sean, for you is I'd love to see more challenge coming out in the chat room when the speakers are on. I mean, I love to look at the chat room, and I'm looking for difficult questions from the floor, that rather than, if you like,
consensus, so to speak.
Consensus.
Yeah.
And the comment, the point that was made, which I fundamentally disagree with, was that the United States was allowing China access to low-cost oil on the premise that they wouldn't supply arms to the Ukraine. That point was physically put into the room. To Russia, sorry, I beg your pardon, thank you, Kate. That point was put into the room. Now, I don't accept that premise for a second. There is definitely, be careful of what you wish for, in terms of the whole marketplace of, we're going to put in a price cap on oil, and oil will move and the markets will get round, if you like, the geopolitical tensions that are out there. And that's definitely what we've seen. Markets do, your words, was function. Function's an interesting word. They get round, if you like, the geopolitical tensions that are exerted in the world. But the one thing which is going on in the background right now, as we're watching China, is that China is indeed accessing lower cost oil than the rest of the world. They are going to use that lower cost oil to, if you like, bring back their economy. We talk about growth in China as if it is, if you like, the single panacea to all things good. The reality is, I'm not American, clearly, but if I was America, what happened to the dialogue we had 4 or 5 years ago around the whole story is about the US-Chinese trade war that's been going on, that the actual fundamental that was driving everything in the markets was a technology challenge, which is the US technology versus Chinese technology. The one thing that I see that's happening quietly is that China is using every tool in the toolbox right now to continue to get ahead. And I think it was Jorge that actually sort of said it. The one place in the world that is really suffering the consequences of all of this right now is Europe.
Yes.
Europe is paying the price for all of this.
Yes.
And I can't see the way out of this right now as we continue to allow this geopolitical situation to flow.
But
So,
to your point though about
Yeah.
Europe, and because I disagree with that.
okay, good.
You know,
I have to remember that. Put Andy and James on the same.
you know, actually, what's happening at the moment is good for Europe. And actually, you've got to look at Europe in the context. Don't look at Europe now. Look at Europe 2030, 2035. Look at the UK 2030, 2035. We look at 25% of UK power is now generated from wind. They're building the world's largest offshore wind area in the Dogger Bank now. We're going to be at 50, 60, 70% power generation by, well into 2040. Fossil fuels and bear in mind, the UK is a good test case. It's the sixth largest economy in the world. It's a major OECD nation. A declining power, but still a regional power of significance. And, the UK, if I'm not mistaken, net energy demand is falling. Yet the economy is still growing. And why is it falling? Because better science, better technology, better construction regulations, better ways of doing things. That's the future. That's how you become competitive. China and India, yes, in terms of them, so much of their growth is pegged on the continuing to grow huge populations and starting from a low base of development, but it's all predicated on cheap fossil fuels, cheap resources. Whereas you look at Europe.
So
Let's give Rachel a chance.
Sorry,
Yeah.
we have to say this. I was in Chengdu close to 25 years
Sorry.
ago. And in Chengdu, all the motorbikes were electrical. Very few people actually understand China, have traveled in China, and they have notions that they are a backward country that just relies on fossil fuels. They rely on everything. Nuclear, fossil, renewables, everything.
Yeah, they rely on that so they rely on renewables and certainly EV penetration in China is quite advanced. But actually, if you look at policy steps that have been taken in the West to counter Chinese competitiveness in industry, and Chinese industry is predominantly fossil fuel driven. You look at steel smelters in China, they're all blast furnaces, all coal fired. There isn't this transition to electric arc, more modern operating practices in China for their industry. CBAM could cripple them. IRA in the US could cripple them. And so I think the important debate here is all these policy steps that are really going to start to kick in and take effect from 2030 onwards to 2050 in these advanced OECD nations. And big economies like India and China will get left behind.
Rachel,
I'm
sorry.
going to respond.
Okay.
You actually said, let's put Andy and James together. That might actually be quite fun, actually. So I'm going to pick back up on Andy's point here. That the point that he actually made, that's good for the UK. You then went into a focus on it's good for the UK in terms of the balance of energy supply going forward with renewables versus fossil fuels. That is one singularly small interpretation of that, Andy. If you take a look at the offshore wind farms that are going into the North Sea at the present moment in time, and there's the vast majority of them are being built with, at best, European wind turbines, and Rob's gone now, so we could have talked about Vestas or whatever in that particular space. But increasingly on the bid list are the Chinese manufacturers of wind turbines. The big wind farm that's going in off the coast, off the Forth right now, which has been put in place by EDF, the substructures are built in Indonesia. The wind turbines are coming from Europe, and with some supplementary Chinese wind turbines on there. The installation is being done by Saipem, an Italian contractor. Now, if you've grown up in the North Sea on the supply chain side of the equation, which is where this question started, on the technology supply side of this equation, which is where the question started, that looks really shitty, Andy. The reality is, and it doesn't matter whether you're looking at it from a Scottish perspective, we could get into that as well, in terms of what's actually interesting. No, exactly. But from the point of view of protecting the supply chain, from the point of view of protecting jobs and employment in Europe versus what's actually going on in China, there is a serious problem here.
So one last comeback. Unemployment in the UK in 1983, the time of the miners' strike, was over 10%. Well, today the UK has full employment. Yeah, and you can chop and change, say these are good jobs, bad jobs. The reality is the UK has full employment. The UK doesn't have an employment issue anymore.
When were you last-
Primarily
when were
because
you last in
we
Aberdeen?
started transitioning. out
Andy, when were
of-
you last in Aberdeen?
Aberdeen's a boom.
There's too many Porsches in Aberdeen. Rachel gets the last word because she's been so patient with all these bullies in the room. Go.
Lots of great ideas. The only thing I was going to point out is how much the point that James started with of we haven't, the U.S.-China trade war and tech war is not in this conversation is such opposed from in others. It points to, I think, an important disconnect between the particularly oil and gas markets that we're focusing on and sort of critical minerals, EV supply chains maybe is a different one, but is so sort of divorced from some of the other technological concepts. And so just to point to, I guess, an interesting blind spot, I think definitely in Washington, and maybe it reflects sort of, who's in government and what sort of industrial policy they're thinking about and the fact that we're even talking about it. But that element, I mean, it always strikes me, sort of in this context, and we started our whole conversation talking about how the price cap, all this sort of energy policy, in effect is designed to allow them, or the net result is the market's working. But also that 3% number, the drop story almost was a sort of bit of a scare tactic to create a policy to keep that flowing. And so there's an interesting, I think, real disconnect between attempts to really not only reshore, but sort of remake supply chains in some ways, but this creeping sort of element of not only Chinese sort of, continued dominance, but also a lot of people don't like it in Washington when I remind them about China being the largest contractor of LNG. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying thinking about the interdependencies that are there and the sort of comfort level that some policymakers in Washington have with the ability to create coalitions against China, either vis-a-vis sort of the Russia-related supply chains, but especially relating to Asia, sort of Asian security going forward. And so there'll be lots to talk about more on that, but just a whole very different conversation than when we're talking about battery supply chain sort of risks, or especially semiconductors and other things like that. That I think maybe is worth exploring, especially in this context of who really benefits, and what release valves the sort of China as swing refined capacity sort of product market sort of place to the marketplace. But